Warpugs, today I'm checking out something requested by RJC Nixon Wins, and this is from the Alternate History Hub, and it's the election that ruined everything and if it never happened. And I know this is on Woodrow Wilson because RJC Nixon Wins said as soon as he heard Old Man's disdain for Woodrow Wilson in the Alternate History Hub video on Kaiserreich, he just had to add to this request list. There's been a few presidents I just have disdain for, okay? There's been a few presidents in history that were complete lame ducks, that screwed up things, that just basically made the nation worse or did something. Woodrow Wilson did something I consider to be worse than that. He set the stage for American intervention. Like, we don't leave anybody alone anymore because of the diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson and what he pretty much set in motion. There are times that I give historical figures a pass if they do something that by modern morality we would consider atrocious. Okay? There are times I do that. Mainly because it's kind of hypocritical and kind of short-sighted of us to judge historical figures on things they were doing that we today consider to be absolutely abhorrent. But I don't give him a pass. At a certain level, the pass stops, okay? The pass completely stops. Like in the instance of apartheid, I'm sorry. None of you guys get a pass. None of you bastards get a pass, okay? None of you. In other cases, it really depends on what the general worldwide consensus was. Woodrow Wilson, the things that he was doing on the slide, he doesn't get a pass for. I'm sorry. You're the President of the United States. You need to calm down. I'm going to stop. I'm going to let him explain it to you because I know he's going to. He usually has a very succinct way of telling you things, and I'm talking off the top of my head here. So I don't want to say anything that's going to kind of... Yes, I'm poisoning the well, but I don't care. It's Woodrow Wilson. Here we go. The election that ruined everything, and if it never happened. Let's go.
Is a funny little codger with a smile, a funny smile.
Yep.
Woodrow Wilson changed everything. No, wait, don't click off. He really did. We seem to have this idea that the more famous presidents are only so famous because they were the most influential, for good or bad. But there have been a few cases, simply due to the span of time, some presidential legacies sort of just get swept under the rug, forgotten by the public, with most never knowing the good, or as we'll eventually get into, the really, really bad. James K. Polk, as an example, is one of the least thought of presidents, alongside good old John Tyler or Martin Van Buren. But Polk was actually incredibly influential, being the main politician behind
If you didn't know this, you're about to find it out.
annexing Texas, going to war with Mexico, and taking half of its land under manifest destiny.
Yep.
But it was the 1840s, so who cares now? Woodrow Wilson got the same treatment too.
And you see, I have to give Polk somewhat of a pass in regards to that, because frankly, that was what everyone else was doing in the world up until around 20 years prior. And then they started doing it again about 20 years later. And then they did it again about 20 years after that, and again 20 years after that. So the concept of conquering a continent wasn't exactly it just really wasn't, an outrageous thing. It was outrageous here considering what happened, but for the worldwide population, it was just like, oh look, they're doing this. Okay.
To the common public, he's really just remembered for World War I and those 14 points you had to study in high school. But then, nothing more. In reality, Woodrow Wilson was not just one of the most influential presidents in US history. His policies and strange philosophies defined the 20th century and the international problems we face today.
Yep.
More defining than FDR, Kennedy, or Reagan. Wilson, the soft-spoken Princeton University president who won the election on a fluke, ended up causing every single event after World War I. I think
Accurate.
Cypher, the cynical historian, puts it the best.
There is a new party which it is difficult to characterize.
Wilson!
And hopefully by the end of our time together, you dear viewer have had that same reaction too. I want to imagine an alternate timeline, a thought experiment, if you will. One where Woodrow Wilson never became president of the United States. Never sat in office in one of the most important crossroads in American history. I don't want to talk about literally every single thing Wilson has done right now, but before we learn about his policies, well, let's learn about the man.
No. People today, I don't understand why people are against like national health care, stuff like that. We were trying to do that way back. Teddy Roosevelt was trying to do that, okay?
I think this guy is the worst president in U.S. history. Seriously. He left the country far worse than he found it. And his pernicious positions and policies perpetually pollute our politics to the present.
Lovely.
See what I did there?
Yes.
Oh boy, now we've got him started.
Oh, I could go on and on. But to cut it short, Woodrow Wilson instilled a new form of imperialism called Wilsonian interventionism that
Yes.
the U.S. continues. He segregated the federal government, helped foster the second KKK
Yes.
through his historian credentials, expanded the executive branch's powers to tyrannical proportions, and soured relations with several emerging nations.
Yep. And he did it because Japan was kept so far. Japan actually was on the Allied side in World War I. Japan sent troops, but they were, when it came time to do the victory conferences and everything like that, they were absolutely ignored.
All in all, someone the world was probably better off without.
That's a good way of putting that. Woodrow Wilson was defined by his childhood. His father was a Presbyterian minister who moved to the South in the years leading up to the Civil War.
Yep.
When the war eventually came, young Wilson saw the destruction of the war, saw the South destroyed by its own rebellion, but also the North invading and crushing all resistance. So growing up in the reconstructed South, Wilson had a chip on his shoulder. He wasn't pro-Confederate secession, more like sympathetic to the Southern cause. Young Wilson despised how the Reconstruction was, in his mind, forced upon a war-ravaged South, how black senators were now in office because of Northern policies.
Oh no!
This shaped him into his eventual career as a historian, which, if you want to know more about in detail, Cypher has his...
Okay, no, he's not a historian, okay? This guy was not a historian. He was a historian in the same way that I am an architect, okay?
writings and papers covered in these videos. The main thing that Wilson subscribed to when looking back on the Civil War was that good old-fashioned lost cause mentality. The idea that secession wasn't over simply slavery, but also over taxes and states' rights. It wasn't just an opinion that
There were a broad variety of reasons behind the Civil War. But the thing about it was, slavery had become such a huge issue at that point. It had become such a monumental issue at that point that everyone wrote it in, and it was legitimate. I'm not going to say it was the entire reason. I'll disagree with anybody that says that, but 75% of the reason, I'll buy that. I'll buy that in a heartbeat. I'll buy that in a split second. There were a lot of other issues that were surrounding the Civil War, but slavery was, I'd say 75% of it. And the thing about it is, not every... the thing that drives me nuts about when people think about the Civil War, not every soldier that fought in that war on the Confederate side was, simply put, fighting for that. I mean, that's just senseless. But it became one of the central guiding things of the war because of the aristocrats in the South. The aristocratic power in the South was incredible compared to any other power. It was its own different power block. The same way that we would have like a Congress, like we have Congress now. The Southern aristocracy was monumentally powerful in the South because they had all the money. Imagine if you had every leader of, like, every Fortune 500 company was privately owned, and those private owners essentially were in one geographic area in a few states. That's what it boiled down to. So when they said, people fight the wars of the rich all the time. It is what it is. If you don't know that, you've been blind to history for a very long time.
That the general public had. It was an actual movement that was influenced by historians.
Look at this.
With, sympathies.
No.
Wilson wasn't just influenced by lost cause revisionism. He was one of the main forces behind it. But even with his experience with the war and Reconstruction, he understood why the South lost, and how secession was the wrong choice. As he matured, his philosophy on the United States began to change. He embraced the idea that the US was the true shining city on a hill, God-ordained nation with the truest civilized creation, democracy. Wilson was a very religious man. This influenced his very philosophy on the world and America's place in it. He had a very my way or highway approach. If you disagreed with his opinions, even if it was, hey, I'm Chinese, I think I know a bit more about what my people want than you, he'd just think, you were wrong, and shut down the conversation. The American ideal was ordained by God, and anyone else was just wrong. It didn't help that Wilson really didn't have that good of a grasp on how the world actually worked,
right,
which didn't make him the most influential or popular when trying to tell his ideas to a Europe which went through 4 years of war. Finally, now that we got all of that out of the way, let's theorize that possibility. What if Woodrow Wilson is not elected? First, how does this happen? Very easily.
Good, he's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about the Bull Moose Party.
Wilson only won the presidency because the election was split 3 ways. Taft for the Republicans on one side, Wilson with the Democrats on another, and Teddy Roosevelt running for the party he created, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt actually was almost nominated as a Republican candidate, almost dethroning an incumbent president, and if he had stuck the course, he might have actually won the Republican nomination. Roosevelt and Taft fought one another and split the Republican vote. And as history has shown time and time again, splitting the vote just leads to, well, the other guy getting it. Yeah. Wilson got the majority and became president. If Taft simply didn't run for office again, or if Roosevelt and his coalition overthrew him in the 1912 Republican National Convention, Roosevelt would run as the Republican against Wilson. And in a race between Teddy and Wilson, well, we all know who would win. Wilson only got 42% of the popular vote. Alternate 1913. The world is on.
Now, 42% of the popular vote. That's well, why would this seem so outrageous? Most presidential elections are decided by less than 5%.
The cusp of war, and Theodore Roosevelt begins his 3rd term as president. And this would be the term that he knew would define him as a global leader. You see, the election of 1912 was probably the most important election in American history. Wilson and Roosevelt had staunchly opposite opinions on where the US should stand once the Great War began. Wilson wanted absolutely nothing to do with the war, which seems reasonable. It was an opinion shared by most Americans. Why get involved into the most deadly conflict in human history that seemed to be fought between bickering neighbors? But Wilson had his own, well, Wilson reasons for doing so as well. Remember that shining beacon ideal he had? That America was the start of a new age of civilization?
Wait for, like...
He saw war as the antithesis to this great democracy, against European countries, that was. Wilson was actually pretty lax when it came to the US intervening in Latin America, or nations in his mind not developed enough for democracy.
Right.
When this war was to be over, he dreamed America would be the mediator between the two sides, and create a middle ground as the moral leader for the West. Picking a side would only ruin such a dream. In fact, even when it came to the final moment in 1917, Germany started back up their unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking neutral ships and offering to Mexico to invade the United States. Wilson still was uneasy, but the tides had changed too far, and he realized America had to get involved. But this time, with a twist on his original idea. America still would retain its moral character while going to war, but only because it wasn't fighting for petty reasons like Britain, France, or Russia, but to make the world safe for democracy. So,
I love it. Sound familiar? Yeah.
Unfamiliar? By the time that 1917 rolled around, Roosevelt had practically ripped out his mustache while demanding for the US to go to war. After the Lusitania was sunk, Roosevelt knew that war was inevitable and wrote furiously that Wilson was a coward for being so indecisive. You see, Roosevelt was a polar opposite opinion. He wanted the US to get into the war to show that it was a real global power.
Yep.
He saw the Great War as an opportunity to finally flex some American muscle and change the globe through force. Now, I know that sounds bad for the US to get itself involved purely to show off, but if Roosevelt was actually president and really did get America into the war by 1915, ironically, most of the pains and sufferings of the 20th century as we know them might not have happened. I know, it's weird, but here's the thing about
it would not be, like, we would not have had the USS, like, if America had gotten involved in the Great War a lot sooner, Germany would have surrendered a lot faster. There would probably not be a USSR. There would definitely be the manner of the defeat would change how Germany viewed World War One. It would change. The biggest thing it would probably change is the Treaty of Versailles. 100%. It would change the Treaty of Versailles. It wouldn't have brought up the conditions where the Treaty of Versailles just made the Second World War a guarantee.
Idealism. It's idyllic. Wilson wanted a world without war, where America was this bastion of morality, but people don't work like that, and his idealism turned into something far worse than just colonial squabbles. The Lusitania sinks in this alternate 1915. I have no doubt that if Teddy was president, the United States would have mobilized for war within a few months. Now I say mobilized. This was 1915. Even after declaring war, it still took months for troops to be ready, supplies to be organized, and men shipped over the Atlantic. In our timeline, even though the US entered the war by 1917, they really didn't flood in until 1918,
True.
by the time the war was ending. So the next few months for Roosevelt would be the hardest of his political career. Not only would he need to convince Congress to declare war, but also the American public, who even then were still not interested in sending men to die in a European war. Could he have done this? That's the problem with hypotheticals. It's very plausible he could have, but also there isn't a true way to know. Wilson was actively putting out any fires for war when in office, and it cost him politically. So perhaps the opposite happens with Teddy, who tries to stoke what little flames in America there was for war and revenge. I think he could make a convincing argument for why the US should get involved. Teddy always boasted about America's hardworking nature when faced against an adversary. Because of that sinking, the US began contributing aid to the Allies, so it might not have taken so much to simply go that extra mile.
Right. No.
Just as one would wish to secure their ships from the pesky Krauts, so should one secure themselves while traversing the internet.
Yes.
What are the internets? I don't know, but I do know that this video was sponsored by NordVPN.com/Althis.
Yes.
A VPN is a virtual private network.
Oh.
Basically, what NordVPN does is it secures your information through it whenever you go online. By accessing a private network with military-grade encryption,
Oh.
you can protect yourself. They have thousands of servers from 60 countries that you can access, and with a simple interface, it's easy to set up. Say I want to have an
I don't know when this was made, but I'm going to let this ad play because I love the theme. Anyhow.
new address from Britain. Well,
Ah.
I can do that. India, too. So many options. And it works on any iOS or Android phones.
Are you sure about that?
And Windows or Mac for computer. For a limited time, get 75% off a 3-year plan at
That's nice.
NordVPN.com/Althist.
I'm going to check and see if this promotion is still going. If it is, it'll be in the description below, guys. If you've been interested in a VPN, why not?
This special offer makes your subscription just $2.99 per month, so you can browse securely on all your devices. And for a short time, use code ALTHIST to get an extra month of Nord for free.
Yay.
Now, back to our scheduled talking picture.
Yes! The talkies. God, now I feel even older.
By
Okay.
1916 in our timeline, both sides had stalemated. Germany was running out of options as a British blockade slowly strangled its economy and resources. However, France, Britain, and Russia weren't faring too well either. Both sides expected the war to be won by now, but the meta of the time was really imbalanced, favoring defense instead of offense. Railroads and machine guns allowed for trenches to be well defended and impossible to retake since both sides were practically even. On the Western Front, all that really needed to happen was one other nation to get itself in and push the scale in the Allies' favor. Britain, France, and Russia knew that, which is why Wilson's constant "I'm above this" approach really rubbed them the wrong way, especially when it continued as the US was in the war, but we'll get to that later. The Americans didn't fight as much in World War I in reality, but they were a welcome sign to breathe new life into the Allied effort, just enough to push the Germans, who already won in the East, into mutiny, rebellion, and finally, armistice. Imagine how bad of a sign this would be for the Central Powers, who by 1916 are already fighting a two-front war, and then the Americans show up. In our timeline, the Germans were able to support their own Western Front by the time the Americans showed up, because Russia was already out of the war by 1918. 500,000 troops to hold back the Allies and France. They don't have this option in an alternate 1916. They simply don't have enough men to hold back both sides. If Germany tried to hold back a break in their Western Front by sending troops from the east to reinforce, this could be the relief that the Russians needed in 1916
Yes.
to buy themselves some time or even make gains in the war. Speaking of which,
Yes!
the Russians were woefully under-equipped and technologically backwards compared to Europe. So,
Oh wow, a lot has changed. So much has changed.
there is no steamroll with mechanized tanks like in World War II. Any gains would be slow, but they would be gains. Germany would fall back mostly because of the pressure from the West. Victories, any at all, I don't think would be enough to help the Tsar keep his position. Even with the US involved, I could see the war going into 1917. A 1917 which created food shortages and a harsh winter for the Russian populace.
Yes.
Something like a February Revolution still might have happened. However, the biggest change, since this is an alternate 1917, is the war ends far sooner. The provisional government that replaces the Tsar oversees not a war of failure, but thanks to its allies, a war of victory.
Yes.
I think you can see where I'm going with this.
Yes, I do.
The Bolsheviks only gained legitimacy because of the failure of the provisional government. A horrible summer offensive in 1917 only left the government appearing weak and unable to rule. The army had no supplies. They were rebelling and refusing to fight. This fanned the flames for another revolution, and wouldn't you know it, Lenin comes back into Russia, and the Bolsheviks, at the time only an extreme part of the Petrograd Soviet, take over. If Germany's war effort weakened by 1916 as the Americans came in, then such offensives by 1917 might not have been failures, but victories.
Right.
Or even the war might be over before any such offensive could take place. With the war ending under provisional government rule, this boosts their popularity and secures their position as leaders of a czarless Russia. There is no Brest-Litovsk Treaty which loses Russia its land, and so when that inevitable meeting of the victors occurs, well, Russia, being a part of the victors, doesn't allow any of its land like Poland, Ukraine, or the Baltic states to be lost. Russia survives the war without a communist revolution, which is why when I said Roosevelt wanting to get into the fight sooner, in hindsight, actually would have been the better timeline.
It would have.
And with that, the war probably ends around 1917. The Central Powers simply don't have the manpower or economic might of the Allies, with Britain and the US backing it. That's 2 years of fighting that never happened.
Millions of deaths that never happen. And the Spanish flu also probably doesn't happen.
Millions by now have already died for a pointless war between 1914 to 1916 or 17. However, the war wouldn't be seen in the general mindset as such a tragedy, just an awfully brutal one, a taste of why modern wars shouldn't be fought in Europe. Speaking of legacy of this war, if Germany was defeated easily militarily and they didn't have to face revolutions or the lack of supplies, there still isn't a way to predict how they would end up. The fate of their future is entirely in the treaty and how they would lose the war, which I can't predict for certain, but there are a few possibilities for how it turns out. So we'll just rush through this.
Okay.
Germany is defeated so badly, they end up losing land and become far smaller than even their post-war borders. The Kaiser resigns and Germany becomes a democratic nation. Germany is defeated just as badly as the first option, but the Kaiser remains in power with his influence greatly diminished, becoming something of a parliamentary monarchy like Britain.
That actually makes sense to me.
Germany loses the borders that it did in our timeline. However, the treaty is not as severe.
Right.
Or, the most extreme option, Germany is completely militarily defeated. The Allies push in and occupy the country just like in World War II. Basically, Germany as a nation doesn't exist for at least a few decades, or until they decide it can be on its own again. This would lead to a lot of colorful debate on which power controls what. Really, there are so many options I could go on.
It would probably be France leading the debate, leading the charge to take control of Germany, considering the relationship between the two at the time.
This is what I could predict, though, and it all centers around Wilson and Russia.
You're right.
Roosevelt was against Wilson going to the treaty conference in Paris because he believed that Britain, who fought more, should have had more of a say.
Right.
That opinion easily could have changed if the US fought only 1 year less than Britain, so perhaps he still goes, or at least as a diplomat with his ideals in place. The main thing that changes in this timeline isn't the inclusion of Roosevelt, but the absence of Wilson. Wilson pretty much used the treaty conference as a way to promote his own worldview, the most infamous of which was, the League of Nations. Austria-Hungary still would collapse, and new nation-states take its place just like in our timeline. But for the victors, they would not lose their territory. Russia going forward still remains relatively backwards compared to the West, but it would never see the mass collectivization and famine like under Lenin and Stalin.
Right.
Oh, which brings me to... The collapse of the Tsar and the failure of the war was the perfect storm to allow such an extremist and violent section of Marxism to take over. The Bolsheviks were the farthest of extremists. They didn't just go after the former autocrats of Russia, but the Mensheviks, less extreme communists, and socialists as well. That iconoclastic, autocratic, and brutal zeal that became the defining mark of communism was birthed from Lenin, and his war against anyone he perceived as an enemy of the revolution. Without Lenin, the entire fate of socialism in the West entirely changes.
And you see, the thing about it is, the bad thing about every single one of these revolutions, what makes you an enemy of the revolution? Anything. Anything and everything.
Along with the enemy that basically fueled Wilsonianism into the modern day. Without the Bolsheviks, there is no great enemy. The rise of communism was such a series of specific steps, I doubt it would be replicated into the 20th century without Russia. It really was only because of the desperately poor environment in that country that led it to be. That brand of communism simply doesn't arise, left to the history books like anarchism.
Oh, snap.
So both sides, capitalistic and socialist, are less extreme in this alternate 20th century. There is no great war between ideologies, which is what Lenin and Wilson ended up perpetuating in their states.
Yep.
Which is where things actually start getting weird, because a lot of policies were shot down in the West once communism rose, because people rightfully feared it'd lead to a Lenin rising in their country. Which is where I'm going to take a detour.
Yeah, let's... Oh, you're gonna
As
love
with
this.
anything hypothetical, predictions aren't 100%. Just possibilities and an alternate path. And in politics, just because a party or politician wishes to do something doesn't mean they could always do it. Opposition always exists, and those outcomes can't simply be predicted. However, if Teddy stayed in office to see the US win the war, this would have been a massive win for the Republicans. They'd have political clout, and potentially could have enacted some new legislation. Teddy, in his first 2 terms, had busted monopolies and created national parks. But he wasn't just satisfied with that. And in the 1912 election, he laid out his goals. A complete overhaul of lobbying in Washington, a registration for lobbyists, and limits on campaign contributions, social insurance for the elderly, a nationalized health service, federal income tax, and an 8-hour workday. The most interesting idea for me is recall elections for those in office.
Yes.
And judicial. Say the court makes a decision.
As of this moment, we still do not have recall for judicial. I think there is some recall for politicians, but we don't have recall for judicial. And that is... no.
Decision that the citizens disagree with. It can be overridden by popular vote. If Teddy was in office, it's likely the war would have taken up a majority of his 3rd term. But considering how hands-offish he wanted to be in the peace conference, unlike Wilson, I think he, or at least some in Congress, could have gotten a few of these concepts into legislation 100 years ago. In the words of Emperor Tiger Star,
He did it with sanitation, he can do it again.
so since we got that out of the way, I decided this last part will be
Okay.
the fate of Germany in a quicker war is entirely up in the air. However, I think there's one pretty simple answer. Hitler doesn't rise.
True.
Now, why do I say that? Hitler's rise to power was not simply him walking into a defeated Germany and saying, he is Führer now. It was just like World War I or Wilson's election, only the result of a string of unique and bad occurrences.
Right.
The fear of the Bolsheviks was a very real reality for post-war Germany in the 20s and 30s. The Soviets were neighbors to Europe. There had been brief yet failed communist revolutions in 1919 in Berlin and Munich, and just like during the Cold War, and fear of the Reds destroying everything was something in the public conscience. Maybe because that's what the Soviets kept saying they were going to do.
Yeah.
While Hitler, yes, rode in on the public fear of the Jews, this also was hand in hand with the fear of the Bolsheviks. But if the war ended in a crushing German defeat, and before the Bolsheviks ever could take control of Russia, those steps that allowed the Nazis to come in power in 1933 become an impossible uphill slope. There simply is no great enemy to fear, and I doubt such a thing as the Reichstag fire would ever have occurred. I really doubt World War II, at least the European war we all know, would have ever occurred. Many wars probably still might happen. Italy, the Balkans are still a thing.
Japan would have still invaded China.
But I doubt the Nazis ever rise to power. What else that wasn't Germany? Oh yeah, the federal government would have remained desegregated. Wilson did that. In fact, the
Yep.
history of civil rights in America might have also went down a different path.
Yep.
Wilson is a complex figure in history. He was a man of startling contradictions. Wilson envisioned liberty as only spreading from a strong central government, or at least a strong central leader himself. Only him, an intellect and orator, could champion democracy through U.S. foreign policy. But in reality, it was just advancing U.S. interests under another name.
True.
Wilson either purposely or unintentionally misunderstood the world he wanted to change and create a mindset which didn't reflect that world, or at worst, didn't care to. Even outside Europe, Wilson used his ideology to send the U.S. into Latin America to protect their interests. And it was really because of this that set a precedent in an age where such practices were becoming less acceptable to an isolationist public. The Wilsonian ideal is the one that still dominates the United States. Fighting for democracy in actual true circumstances is a noble one, but ever since its inception, we have to understand it's also been a double-edged sword, one that can be corrupted into serving ulterior motives under the costume of liberty. It's a reason U.S. foreign policy post-World War II has seemed so contradictory. It ended up overthrowing governments in Latin America and the Middle East. Teddy's old speak softly and carry a big stick style of imperialism was unique. It wasn't colonialism. The US was sick of that after the Philippines. It was more of get in, get out. Wilsonianism was about transforming the country that the US invaded. Wilsonianism did replace this old imperialism, but also modified it enough for imperialism to evolve and survive in the next stage of global empire. The battle over ideologies, the Cold War, or now, the battle between West and East. You know how they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, our road to hell was paved by mixed intentions. Wilson transformed foreign policy into a holier-than-thou, protector of civilization approach, even when, it wasn't. But guess which one stuck around the longest? Now you may say, Cody, this was 100 years ago. Surely you can't put the blame on the rise of communism, Nazism, foreign endless wars, and the Cold War all on one man's presidency, can you?
Yes.
Yes.
The answer to that is yes. In so many ways, yes. Well, I think I've ranted and raved alongside this for enough time. Warpugs, there's a few presidents that I just really for the love of the Emperor, I wish they had never. No. There were so many of them that were flat out lame ducks. There were some that were good, but a lot of the policies that we consider like socialism today, and or just set off like certain kinds of reaction among people, stem from exactly what he was talking about. With the rise of communism, communism was such a big deal. Like, it was such a huge deal, but it would have died in its infancy if not for essentially, the United States not getting involved in the war a lot sooner. There was a lot of things that Roosevelt wanted to do that would have been considered outright, Roosevelt couldn't run as a Republican or a Democrat these days. He just couldn't have done it. His ideas would have been too extreme. He would have been considered a left-leaning libertarian, I believe. He would be considered one of the psycho ones, too. In any case, I'm gonna shut up. I probably offended some people by saying he was gonna be a left-leaning libertarian, but in any event, Warpugs, all of Alternate History Hub's links are going to be in the description down below. Definitely check him out. It's an awesome place to go. I'm going to head out from here. All my links are going to be in the description down below. And, yeah. Between him, Woodrow Wilson, who I don't think he was the worst president ever. I just think he was one of the he was like top 5, easy, top 3. But in between that and just constantly sitting there slamming my head into a wall, wondering why we get involved. If you ever wonder why we get involved in so many foreign issues, that's why. I'm out. Warpugs, you have a wonderful night. And I'll catch you guys next time. Wilson.